this little video, I want to introduce you to the idea of shape keys inside of Blender. It's a really powerful way of doing some simple animation setups. There is plenty to explore here. We're just going to touch on the basics. So we're going to start just with a simple scene where we have our default cube. And as we know, we can move that cube around, we can go into edit mode, we can mess around with the different elements inside of that geometry in terms of faces, vertices, and edges. Over on the right hand side of our screen where we have our properties panel, with our cube selected, we can go to our data properties. And inside of here is a tool called shape keys. So essentially how this works is this is establishing kind of key states for the shape of our object. We can add a shape key by clicking on the plus symbol here. And this first one is going to be at the top of our stack. And in this instance with this shape key, this is like the rest position. This is what our object naturally looks like. So we should leave that as it is. It's called the basis. Then we can add an additional key. So clicking on the plus symbol, and then that allows us to give some additional options. And here we have the option to say that this key is relative to the basis. So we need that base key initially, then any additional keys where we actually want to do some animation work or changes we can add afterwards. Once we have that key selected, what we can do is we could go into edit mode, we could select an element of our shape, and we can move that shape around. So I've guided that top face over to the side. If I now press tab, I come out of edit mode and my cube looks how it was initially. So we're in this rest state for the basis of our object. But with this key now selected, I've got a value for my key, and by default it's set to 0, but I can change the value of that and take it to 1, and the 1 value is the maximum of that key, and our shape morphs into that second state that we left our shape in. And then this then allows us to play around with this idea of having multiple kind of morphs or states or different states of our geometry, and then we can kind of slide between those with these keys. So we can have we could use this to have mid states, so we don't have to go from the value of 0 to 1 like a switch. We can have all of the variants in between to get a kind of transitional state. And this will then allow us to do some animation work. So to the right of the value there, we have this little button. We can see that in a lot of instances throughout Blender, but that's where we can animate that property. So the process would be to move our playhead to where we want our action to begin. So let's say 20 frames down there. Let's set a keyframe to be 0 for that value. Let's move along in time by another 20 frames, change that value, and then record that by setting an additional keyframe. That's then displayed down the bottom with these diamond shapes, very similar to programs like After Effects, where we have keyframes in place on our timeline. And then as I move my playhead backwards and forwards, I see that animation take place. We can move the keyframes around by selecting them, pressing G to guide. So the same way that you would move something in the general layout space, we can do that by moving around our keyframes. We can select multiple ones and guide them so we can move around as to when they happen in time. And that is essentially the gist of shape keys. We can add multiple keys that can do lots of different things. So we could have another key that does a slightly different move, another key that can do a slightly different move. So you've got some various options. But once you start staggering and layering those up, you can then do some quite interesting things of sequentially or at the same time have some of those shape keys animating. It's a really powerful workflow. How I am going to be using it is inside of a low poly room build model, where each of these elements has its own separate geometry. It's a separate object, and I want to get this idea of the room animating and building up over time. I've already started some work on this, but I want to go through the workflow with this bed element for an example. So I might start with the bed itself, and so I can just isolate that bed by doing the / key on my keyboard. Excuse me. And what how I could animate this is I just want it to kind of grow over time to appear. With this object, I could either potentially have it growing from the floor upwards, but I think in this case, I want it to grow kind of on the y-axis, so kind of scaling out from this back wall. So a quick way of potentially setting that up is if I go into edit mode, I can select a face in the center, in the back. You could do this as an edge or a vertex, something in the center of the plane in which we want that thing to scale from. And we have this thing called our 3D cursor inside of our world. And so in edit mode, with that face selected, if I do Shift S, I get up this little pie menu, and I can do cursor to selected. And that will then bring my 3D cursor to align with that face that I have selected there. If I then tab out, another thing I can do is hold down my full stop key. I get another little pie menu here. And this is like the origin point. You can also change this at the top of our screen here. So I want to change this to be 3D cursor. And what that means now is if I were to scale this object, it will now scale from the 3D cursor as its origin point. Okay. So with that mentality in place, if I set up a shape key, so in my data properties for that object, so there's my base model, then I'm going to add another shape key. Then if I go into edit mode, select all of my faces, and I want to scale them on the y-axis, and I want them all to align to flatten with that 3D cursor. So if I scale them to 0, and click to confirm, what I've done with that object is squish all of those faces to align with that 3D cursor. If I press tab, remember the same thing happened with the cube. I'm back to my base model, but now I've got this shape key animation of this element stretching out over time. If I bring this back to my room, I can take a look at what that looks like inside of my scene. So I'm going to animate my bed to kind of grow out over time. Now, what we do have though in its kind of folded up state here is that we can still see that that geometry in space. So it's going to still be there as this flat plane. There could be potentially ways of just hiding that. I could just move it backwards by a few pixels inside of the wall, so that when it pops out, it's hidden by that wall and then it pops through. But that's not always going to be the case. So there's another thing we can do in terms of setting up the animation for this, and that's all to animate the material or the visibility of the material that's been assigned to that object. Let me think about where I want my animation to take place. So let's go at 160 frames here. Let's animate the bed to start with. So if I bring my value up to 1, set a keyframe, then come forward a few frames and set that to be 0. Now I've got that animation of that bed appearing. Let's go back to solid modes just so we can see what's going on there. Okay, So it's animating over my, or underneath my covers at the moment. I'm going to animate those separately in a second. One thing to do then with the material, so let's go into material preview so we can see this. If I go to the material properties for this object, I have a material assigned to it. If I've reused this material multiple times inside of my project, and I want the timing of the appearance to be different, I will need to have its own unique copy of that material. So this is a material that I've used on pretty much the entirety of my scene. So I'm going to make a new copy of that, which is this little button down the bottom here. So with the material selected, add a copy. So it's the same material, but it's now its own individual instance of that material. And in the principled BSDF, we've got this option for alpha. So how visible is this material? So I've got my animation already in place. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back by a frame, and I can do that just by dragging the playhead or just using my arrow keys left and right on the keyboard. So if I come back a frame and I'm going to bring the alpha of that material down to 0, you can see it disappears. And just like with the shape keys, I've got a little keyframe here. So I can keyframe the alpha to be 0. Then I'm going to come forward 2 frames and change that alpha to be 1. So I'm staggering those keyframes around that animation. So it's going to appear, but then it's also going to animate over time. Okay. Then I can repeat the process on my next object. So this one, let's identify this. So this is the cover of the bed. So I think with this one, I might end up doing 2 shape key animations. So I'm thinking about the point around which I want it to scale and appear. And I can take maybe these faces here, do that Shift S, cursor to selected, and then tab out. Then I'm going to come over to my shape keys. I'm going to add a basis. Then I'm going to add a new shape key. And in this one, I'm going to go into edit mode, select all of my faces with A, and then I'm going to scale this on the y-axis again by 0. So you see it's kind of flattened everything there. That's going to be my shape key for that. But I think I might also like to have a scale on the Z as well. So I'm going to add an additional shape key with the little plus key there. And then scale on the Z axis by 0, which is going to flatten it down. So I've got 2 options here. Well, I've got loads of options, but it looks like I've just got 2 options in terms of I've got this animation of it scaling up with that shape key, or with that shape key, I've got it animating on lengthwise. But I could do a combination of the 2. So if I think about my timing, so I've got my bed appearing here. Let's say just before the bed appears, I'm going to start doing my animation. So if I bring this back to 1, but also this one down to 1, and set a keyframe for that value, and on my first key also set a keyframe for that, then I'm going to move along a bit. And so my second keyframe here was my Z. So let's animate that here. So this appears up. But whilst that's coming up, I also want to start thinking about animating the length of it as well. But let's come along in time, and for this one, keyframe it to be 0. And let's see what's happening now. So both animations are starting at the same time. So it's getting a little bit of depth as it's getting its height, and then it's going to roll out. But I think I maybe want my height to happen a little bit faster. So these are my height keyframes. Let's guide those back in time. I can see that animation now happening faster. So that's going to whip up and then roll out. You don't have to do the sound effects, but it helps. Okay, so I've got my animation down. I now just need to animate the material as well, so it fully disappears. In fact, in this case, because I've scaled it on both axes, it's actually invisible to start with. But just to be on the safe side, I'm going to come in here, duplicate that material, set its alpha to be 0, and then 2 frames after this one, or 2 frames forward. So it's staggered around, so it's going to appear over time. Okay, now let's do the pillows. So isolating them, finding a base to work on. So let's go with maybe these ones here. And if you select multiple faces and do this Shift S, cursor to selected, it will go in kind of the midpoint of those pieces. So my 3D cursor is down the bottom there. Let's go to Shape Keys, add a shape key as the basis, add an additional shape key to work with, go into edit mode, scale it down on the Z axis. And maybe also within this shape key, I'm going to scale it on its Y axis by 0 as well. So this one is going to do both of those moves as one key. So it's going to scale forwards and up, so on the Y and the Z at the same time, which is quite nice. Okay, then let's come back to our animation here and think, when do we want that to happen? And it's quite nice to have some kind of crossover with your animation. So as one thing is happening, as it's still moving, to have this animation starting as well. So let's keyframe that, come forward by a few frames and pop that up, set a little keyframe. So as well as that moving, that pillow is popping up too. And this pillow is actually just a copy of this pillow. So I might delete that pillow, and then this one I'm just going to duplicate and move over here. So it's Shift D, and now both of those pillows are going to be moving and animating at the same time. But this one, I might take those keyframes and just guide them back in time a little bit. So it's got its own unique set of animated keyframes. So we've got a little bit of staggered animation happening with those. Let's also remember to do the material animation on that as well. And in this case, I can also, because they're sharing the same material, I can make a copy. So with one of those pillows selected, this one here, I've made a copy of that material. Let's come and do our alpha to 0. Set a keyframe, move forward a couple of frames, alpha to 1. And then, so that material has also been animated. And this one, rather than repeating that process, I can take this, select this pillow, shift select this pillow, and I can go copy material to selected. So this has now also got that same material with those same animations on as well. And I think then that my entire scene is potentially animated now. Yeah. So I've already done some work. Oh, I haven't done my rug yet, but we can do that later. But now I have a system where, oh, my video's gone. You can still hear me, right? I've now got a system where all of these elements animate up over time. I think I might need to move the timing of the bed sections. So let's select all of those elements. So I see all of those keyframes in the timeline here. And I think I would like them to happen roughly here. So let's take those and guide them all the way back here. So now a whole scene is animated to pop up and appear using shape keys. Pretty cool, right? So sorry that my face disappeared at some point during the video, but you get the idea. So I hope that's useful, and it's really powerful. So make the most of this, have some fun with it, and yeah, good luck. Cheers.